Okay, do come and sit down, please. If you can fill in from the middle, that would be especially useful. I can promise that anyone leaving us 3 seats between them will be denied wine when we serve afterwards. So, Okay, great. I think it's time for us to get started. I'm really excited to welcome you to this, the final session of the day, not least because we've skirted around this issue kind of quite a bit in the preceding 2 sessions. And so I'm really delighted that we get a little bit of chance to dig into what I think, at least for me, is really the kind of key theoretical question raised by populism. And that is the kind of gap between people and the elites. I think it's obvious to those of us who are following this issue, and we've heard lots of examples today about where this gap is kind of really able to see this gap, whether that's on issues of kind of gender or identity or race, or if it's to do with kind of issues such as the environment. I think it's becoming obvious that there is a kind of the people who run society, what we will, for the rest of the session, I guess, use the shorthand elites, they seem to have a very different set of values, very different ideas and an agenda to probably the bulk of the population across Europe. And for me, understanding and disentangling that is kind of crucial to the question of populism. So in this session, we're going to dig into how does that gap emerge, what does it mean for contemporary politics going forward, and hopefully we can shed some light also on the question of how do we challenge this. To kick us off and give us a little bit of a kind of theoretical framework to help understand this, I'm really delighted that we're joined by Matthew Goodwin. Matthew Goodwin, I'm sure, is known to all of you as already his excellent book, which really kind of set off the contemporary debate on this issue. National populism has already been mentioned, but since then he's really been at the forefront of thinking through what populism means for contemporary politics, resulting in a variety of books and publications, including most recently Values, Virtues and Voice. But perhaps more interestingly for me, he's not just someone who's content to kind of publish books in academia, but has really been out there in the public sphere making his case. He's pioneered really the use of Substack to reach a different audience, which has been a really, really big success story for him. So I'm really delighted that we've got someone who's not just kind of thinking about this, but also trying to bring that message out and understand what it means for the public. So in a minute, Matthew will kick us off with a short lecture. And then we're going to hear from our 2 excellent respondents. So sitting next to me is Sabine Beppler-Spahl. She runs the German liberal think tank Freiblickinstitut. I've known Sabine for a while. She's spoken at lots of events that I've been involved in. I'm always delighted to kind of share a panel with her. So really excited to hear what she has to say. And then last but by no means least is Petra, Andits, who's a Seal of Excellence Fellow at the Free University of Bozen-Bolzano, and is one of those very, very annoying people you meet if you're a British person in Brussels who speaks literally 9 languages, putting me very much to shame. So anyway, really excited to hear what Petra has to say. Lots of her academic research focuses on protest movements, which is obviously a key topic for us. So let's get things started and kick off. Hand over to Matthew, who's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll get some responses, and then obviously some questions and comments from the discussion. But Matt.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob. Thank you to Frank Brady. Thank you to the MCC for organising such an interesting debate and day where I've learned a great deal already. It's also very kind of you to mention my Substack. I'll mention Frank's as well, because we're supportive of one another. To give you a little insight, tomorrow I'm publishing the inside story of how Britain came to reject puberty blockers for children. And it's about the activists that were involved in that fight to overturn what I would consider to be child abuse. But what I'm trying to do with that platform is bring about countercultural change within our national debate. And at the heart of this, obviously, is the debate over populism. And I actually started looking at this issue more than 20 years ago. Jean-Marie Le Pen had just done surprisingly well in 2002, and the Austrian Freedom Party had just joined the coalition government. And at that time, I was working in the academic literature on populism. And one of the reasons I've actually found today so refreshing is because the academic literature on populism is a deeply political literature. It is dominated by people who have a very open political agenda, who tend to lean very strongly to the left, and who, to be blunt, I don't think are capable of actually answering the questions that we've been asking today, because so much of populism is viewed through the lens of Marxism and social democratic politics. What I've been trying to do, and certainly through the book that we published in 2018, National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy, is actually take a more level-headed view as to what is driving this movement forward and why I think the future will very much be a future for national populism. Roger Eatwell and I argued that this is a very distinctive movement with a very distinctive ideological tradition that you can trace back more than 100 years. National populism is not just a protest movement, as we heard today. I disagree with that. It is a very distinctive ideology in its own right. It can be defined as a movement which prioritizes the interests and the culture of the national group against what it perceives to be an elite that is corrupt, self-serving, and dismissive of that wider group. We argued that one of the reasons why people voted for Brexit, people voted for Donald Trump in 2016, I suspect they'll vote for Donald Trump again in November, is really because of four big drivers of support for national populism that are interlinked. If you take 30 years of research in the social sciences, you look at all of the studies that have been done on populist voters, there are four key things that stand out. The first is these movements are driven partly by distrust. But it isn't just political distrust. It isn't just a distrust of the established political class. It's a distrust of all established institutions for reasons that I'll come on to. If you look, for example, at public confidence in the university system in the United States, Gallup has just shown that confidence has fallen to the lowest level in history. It's not just a distrust of parliament, of legislatures, of the established parties. It's a distrust of the creative industries, the cultural institutions, the educational institutions, the way in which increasingly our children and young people are being exposed to highly contested political belief systems that are often lacking in evidence, from critical race theory to gender ideology. It's secondly also tapping into feelings of deprivation, not economic deprivation, that's part of it, but relative deprivation. A sense that my group, relative to other groups in society, is being left behind, not just economically, but being left behind in terms of culture, in terms of recognition, in terms of esteem, in terms of social honor. If you look at one of my favorite studies of populism by Peter Hall at Harvard, he makes the point that if you look at all of these movements across Europe, one of the strongest drivers of public support for them is a sense that subjectively, myself and my wider group, this isn't just about self-interest, but myself and my wider group are being left behind relative to other groups in society. And that sense of relative deprivation, I think, is absolutely key. Thirdly, a sense not just that immigration is too high, but that immigration is destroying our way of life, our national community, and our identity. We heard a bit about Brexit Britain earlier on. Let me tell you, Brexit Britain is turning into a disaster, but not for the reasons you think. I was fairly comfortable with people voting for Brexit. I thought living in a self-governing independent country was a pretty good thing. What I've since discovered is that the Conservative Party actually has no serious interest in delivering on the vote for Brexit. What we've been exposed to is levels of immigration we've never seen before in our history, and we've been exposed to low-skill, low-wage, non-selective immigration, which has seen our net migration figures rise to 700,000 over the last year. Much of that migration is not what Boris Johnson promised. It's not high skill, it's not high wage. It is undermining our national community and our national economy. Here's two stats to consider. If you look at the 2 million people that entered Britain over the last 2 or 3 years, what percentage do you think came to work in high-skilled jobs? The answer is 15%. Outside of those workers, students, relatives of students, asylum seekers, refugees. And if you look at where Britain is going in the future, by 2036, which is only 12 years from now, by 2036, 6.5 million people will enter Britain, 6.1 million because of migration. 92% of our population growth will be because of migration, and the vast majority of that migration will come from outside of Europe. And if you look at every serious study of the fiscal impact of migration, in fact, Ralph has a nice piece on this in Unheard, the evidence is very clear. It is a net fiscal cost to the national economy. It is not a net fiscal benefit. So these fears over the destruction of our ways of life, our community, and our identity are very real. And underpinning national populism, the reason we're seeing some of the remarkable numbers in Germany, the reason we're seeing Vox breaking through in Portugal, the reason we're seeing the Sweden Democrats running the government from behind the scenes is because of a fourth factor, which is de-alignment. All political scientists now share a consensus that party systems have entered a new era of de-alignment, that we no longer are seeing the tribal allegiances that used to hold voters together with the mainstream parties, and that volatility is much stronger among the under 30s. The reason why Marine Le Pen, for example, is doing so well among young women, especially in the hospitality sector, young people under the age of 30, the reason why many national populist parties in Europe are doing well among Gen Z is because we're entering this much more volatile period in politics. So if you put those four things together, that sense of distrust, that sense of deprivation, of destruction, of de-alignment, what we argued in 2018 was that these movements are only going to become stronger and stronger because the established political class, the cultural class, the expert class has not shown itself willing or able to respond to the grievances that are pushing these movements forward. And I think, therefore, we need to spend a lot more time looking at the ruling elite and looking at the people who are actually in control of the institutions and less time looking at the populist voters. Because every time I look at a new study of populist voters, it tells me the same thing, that the core drivers are the same. I think what's changed since 2016 is the ruling elite. So let me just essentially summarize what I think in a sentence. We are living through the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s. That essentially is what we are living through and have been living through since the votes for Brexit and the vote for Donald Trump. And what I mean by that is increasingly the nature of the elite class has been changing. And in a book published last year called Values, Voice and Virtue, what I argued, more specific to Britain, but I think the argument applies to many other Western democracies, is that the elite class has been changing in many important ways. The rise of a new elite that is mainly comprised of elite university graduates who tend to come from affluent families, who tend to live in the big cities, who tend to lean left on cultural issues, who tend to vote for centre-left parties, or at least embrace social liberalism, if not radical woke progressivism, that new elite is now vying for power with an old economic elite, and in many institutions has actually become the dominant elite class. And we're living through a competition, really, within the elite that is seeing what we would call in Britain the old Tory elite being increasingly replaced by this new graduate, socially liberal elite that largely defines itself by its educational achievement and by its social liberalism, if not its radical woke progressivism. David Goodhart, for example, has called this group the Anywheres. David Brooks has referred to this group as the bourgeoisie bohemians. Christopher Lasch was probably one of the first to notice that the great struggle of our time would not be the masses rebelling against the elites, but the elites rebelling against the masses. And what we've seen since 2016, I think, is the ruling class, about 15 to 20% of the country, essentially coming to define itself, coming to distinguish itself from the masses through its cultural values. And we've not really seen that before. Rob Henderson, who I'm sure you'll know, he's got a really interesting new book out about the history of his life, going through various foster homes, was at Cambridge, has referred to this group as a luxury belief class on the basis that they routinely advocate policies that bring them few costs, which they use to signal their elite credentials to other members of the elite class, but which impose enormous costs on everybody else. Mass immigration would be an example. Gender ideology would be another. Critical race theory and the belief that Western nations are institutionally racist would be another. What many members of the elite class are saying when they say, as the BBC do, that we should teach our children about white privilege, or that we should teach children there are more than 100 genders, is essentially they are saying, we have an elite education, you don't, and this is primarily a source of our social status and our sense of esteem and superiority over everybody else. And that luxury belief class, I think, has become intimately concerned with its educational identity. If you look at the work by people like Runa Stubega, she's shown that increasingly the elite today define themselves not just by their material and economic wealth, Obviously, everything is interrelated, but mainly by their elite education, by the universities they came from, and by their social networks, which are filled with other members of the elite class who share their cultural values. Mike Savage, who's a sociologist in the United Kingdom, has shown that today's elite are much more socially exclusive than any other group in society. They've always been that way, of course, but today it's become especially noticeable in reaction to things like Brexit and Trump, that they don't just disassociate themselves from the rest of society, but that they actively look down on others within society. For example, members of the new elite are the most likely to unfriend people on Facebook, to unfollow people on X, to say they'd be uncomfortable if their son or daughter married a Brexit voter or a Trump voter, are much more likely than people on the right to hold those views, and are increasingly looking down on other people in society because it's an important source of their moral righteousness and their sense of superiority. I think a lot of people now can sense that, and I think, to be blunt, voters aren't stupid. I think they can see in the reaction to things like Brexit and Trump that we have a radicalizing elite class that isn't really interested in addressing the grievances that voters hold. And I think if you look, for example, at some of the work that's been done in the United States by people like Zach Goldberg on what he would call the great awakening of the elite class, I think it's very revealing. What Zach has shown, he's now at the Manhattan Institute, is that increasingly over the last 10 years, members of the new elite have drifted much further to the cultural left than average voters. They've become much more obsessed, for example, with the idea that Western nations cannot move forward unless they address historic injustices. They've become much more likely to think racism is the predominant problem facing Western nations. They've become much more supportive of minority group rights. They've become much more hostile to members of their own group. For example, in the United States, white graduate liberals are now more likely to express warmth towards minority groups than to their fellow white Americans. And so what we're seeing increasingly is the elite class moving sharply to the cultural left and embracing radical woke progressivism to try and disassociate itself from everybody else. And I think you can see the radicalization of the elite class in three specific areas. And just before I go into them, I think it's important to say that one of the reasons why I find this so troubling is because these are the people who dominate almost all of the institutions in society. From the universities to legacy media, BBC, legislatures, politics, creative industries, museums, galleries. There is no conspiracy going on within the institutions. It's just that the institutions are dominated by elite graduates who have moved left on culture, so they've taken the institutions with them. I think as a thought exercise every morning, I look at the BBC homepage to interpret how the BBC, which is dominated by elite graduates from affluent backgrounds, interprets the world. And of course, what that gives you is a lens into the mindset of radical progressives. If you look at some of the reports that have been done by groups like More in Common, which is I think it's fair to say, a fairly centrist think tank, More in Common have shown that in most Western democracies, radical progressives represent 15% of their society, 1/5. But they disproportionately dominate almost all of the institutions. So in that way, they're shaping the prevailing conversation. They're shaping the narratives that we tell ourselves about who we are. They're shaping the curriculum in schools. They're shaping the reading lists at universities. They are the gatekeepers of knowledge, what Jonathan Rauch would call the epistemic class. They decide what is legitimate and what is illegitimate to discuss and debate in society. I was struck on Monday evening. I held a debate in the heart of London on whether immigration was good or bad. And within 24 hours, we'd sold 700 tickets and we'd sold out the venue because nobody in Britain is having that conversation in the mainstream debate. Even after October the 7th, if you're somebody like Suella Braverman and you say maybe we have a problem with multiculturalism, the policy, which is immediately obvious to anybody who lives outside the M25, that we have highly segregated communities, that we have many people within Britain who, to be blunt, do not want to share British ways of life and who express openly sympathy for radical Islamism. Suella Braverman is then roundly attacked as being an unacceptable voice in British politics. 14 years ago, Angela Merkel and David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy were able to say multiculturalism as a policy is not working. But today, as the elite class have moved further to the cultural left, they've narrowed what is acceptable and what is not acceptable within the social square. within the public square. So those norms and taboos, words like far right, hate, misinformation, have been expanded in order to silence or stigmatize views and values that run counter to the elite. So those three areas where I think you can see this most noticeably, and as I've argued in my last book, relate to values, voice, and virtue. We see it in the values which dominate wider society. It is the values, the tastes, the lifestyles, and the priorities of the elite class that are imposed on the rest of society, whether that relates to pro-EU positions, net zero, gender ideology, radical progressivism, how we think about who we are, our national identity. As my friend and colleague Eric Kaufmann has argued in his book White Shift, what we are seeing is the rise of a new doctrine among the elite class, which we can call asymmetrical multiculturalism, which goes that for the new elite, it is essentially diversity that is the foundation of national identity. That you are only able to celebrate your national identity if it is interpreted through the lens of diversity. But as even Francis Fukuyama has pointed out, to say that the basis of your identity is diversity is fine, you can say that. But to say that the only thing that defines your national identity is being welcoming of others is like saying you have no national identity of your own. And I think for lots of voters, asymmetrical multiculturalism is very problematic because on the one hand, it forces voters to reshape their sense of identity around universal liberal themes, around the celebration of multiculturalism, around the celebration of diversity, while also simultaneously telling them that there is something wrong with their identity, that there is something shameful about their identity, but that they should simultaneously promote and preserve the identities of minority groups. And that hypocrisy at the heart of multiculturalism, hypocrisy in how we think about national identity, I think underpins national populism in a major way. I think you can also see it in the realm of voice, in the realm of the institutions. If you look at every major institution in Western democracies today, those institutions are increasingly shaped around projecting the voice of the elite minority at the expense of others in society. There's a wonderful book that I like called Diploma Democracy, which was written by two academics, which shows how legislatures and parliaments across Europe are now dominated overwhelmingly by elite graduates who come from the same backgrounds and share the same values. But it's not just politics, even in media. Take British media, for example. Local media's collapsed, regional media's collapsed. The only way of making it international media today is if your mother or father were in media or you happen to belong to the affluent elite social group. So the national conversation is being dramatically narrowed in media as well as in creative industries, in publishing, in the civil service, in government organizations and departments. The British civil service, for example, is more exclusive today than it was in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher came to power. And often even diversity is used to conceal the fact that there is no diversity of thought in the institutions. Many of the people who are held up as evidence of diversity share exactly the same socially liberal values and beliefs as the new elite. And I think you can also see it in the third area, which I refer to as virtue, which is the way in which the new elite have embraced a narrative of identity politics, whereby increasingly social status, social recognition, social esteem, social honor are given now only to minority groups and members of the new graduate elite, while those who belong to the wider majority, to the white majority, or belong to the wrong minority group, as is the case with Jews, are seen as the oppressors, are seen as the low status oppressor groups. People on X often ask me, you talk about woke, can you define it? My definition of woke is very simple. It's a sacralization of racial, ethnic, and cultural minorities. It is viewing racial, sexual, and gender minorities as sacred and as things that cannot be criticized and challenged. And everything flows from that simple fact. If you belong to that group, you are a victimized, high-status member of the ruling class. If you do not, you are a low-status, morally inferior member of the oppressor majority. Increasingly, we see that narrative taking hold of schools, universities. In Britain, the incoming Labour government has confirmed it will mainstream critical race theory, teaching children about white privilege. teaching them about identity politics, importing the same narratives from America. Britain, as a recent book aptly pointed out, is not America. So what do we do in my final 30 seconds? We need to reform the institutions. We need to establish new vehicles and ecosystems that give voice to people from outside of the new elite. That means Substacks, YouTube channels, alternative media, new television channels, new publications, anything that can rival legacy institutions. It means we need to somehow find ways of giving much greater expression to the values of the majority. Just to give you one statistic, in Britain, we are now living through the greatest experiment with mass immigration that we've ever had. Yet in 80% of all constituencies in Britain, support for reducing migration is a majority view. But what we have is a public policy that's being reshaped around the values and the preferences of the elite minority. So we need new vehicles that will give much greater expression to the values and the voice of the forgotten majority. And lastly, I think we need a lot more events like this, which allow alternative interpretations of national populism and European politics to actually make it into the wider debate. Because if you look at the universities and academia, the discussion over populism is intimately shaped by individuals within the new elite who view populism as not just problematic, but as inherently anti-democratic, as inherently challenging to the values and the belief system of that minority class. And that means bravery, because to be frank, if you are in academia or research, standing up and advocating an alternative view has very real personal and professional costs. And that takes courage and it takes bravery, and it means cultivating and supporting younger scholars, younger researchers who are willing to break with groupthink and put forward an alternative view. And that means bringing them into the think tanks and bringing them into the alternative ecosystem and pushing them forward as hard as we push ourselves. So just a few thoughts to help us move forward. I'm conscious I've gone 2 minutes over my deadline and Jacob is staring at me, and I'm the last thing between you and a glass of wine. So thank you very much.
Thank you, great. No, a surefire way to buy yourself an extra minute is to start complimenting the host. So I'll let you run over. But Sabine, do you want to offer some thoughts in reflection?
Yep. So I do agree with Matthew that the main problem we have at the moment are our elites. And this was actually the question posed in the introduction of this session is, are the populists right to say that the elites are at the heart of many of our problems? And I think, yes, they are. And I think maybe where I might disagree a little bit is that our elites are far less comfortable than it might seem. So there's a lot of problems which our elites have said they might solve. You've mentioned immigration. You mentioned Angela Merkel saying that she says multiculturalism has failed. In fact, she had 5 or 6 more years in government and wasn't able to reduce immigration at all. So so immigration is a problem which is unsolved and remains unsolved. Sorry, I got myself in a muddle here because I thought I was supposed to respond. Anyway, they promised us for 5 or 6 years they were going to get this problem solved since 2015, and they haven't. So people are saying either they can't solve it or they don't want to solve it. And there are a number of other problems which have been exposed in these last years. Energy policy, for example, which is very close to my heart. Our energy policy in Germany is absolutely crazy, it's absolutely nuts. It doesn't make sense to anybody anymore. A couple of days ago, we had a study on by a very high supreme federal authority saying our energy supply is precarious. Electricity costs have rocketed. They've been rocketing for years with very, very dire consequences for our economy and people's living standards. The future of farming, it was mentioned here already several times. I've never seen so much solidarity with farmers before. So when the farmers started blocking roads in Europe, in Berlin, in January, there was massive support for them, people standing by the streets and cheering and supporting them, saying, we want food production to be secured in our countries, and we're very, very worried to see that it's at peril. We have a war going on just about 1,000 kilometers away from where I live, which is Berlin, and yet we hear that our defenses are not up to standards. We hear that the German army is completely inefficient, despite a lot of money having gone into it. Gone into the wrong channels, obviously, gone into public advisors. So people are saying, what kind of elite do we actually have? They're not solving the main problems of our society. And one of the main arguments they present is that, well, you might not be happy with us, but do you think the populists are better? Do you think they will solve the problem? They're trying to tell us that with the populists, everything is going to get much, much worse. And I think that's an argument we really need to refute. We really need to reject, because it actually supports one of the worst political messages of our elites of the last years, which is the message that there is no alternative. Somebody else said it earlier today in one of the sessions. And we know that once we accept there's no alternative, that would be the end of democracy as we know it. And it's actually very heartening and a normal reaction that people are saying we're not accepting that anymore. I also think it's wrong. I actually think it's factually wrong. I don't think the populists are as bad as the elites, because they've achieved some very important things. They've managed to put some of the major issues back up onto the agenda. Just imagine what our politics would be like without populists. We'd still be talking about all the things the elite wants to talk us about, which would be an absolute disaster. They've given people a voice. There's also, I think, a lot of hysteria about populists, telling us that if populists came back into control, we'd be going down that path of authoritarian politics or right-wing politics. And in fact, as it's been said here earlier today as well, I've never seen such authoritarian policy as from our elites at the moment. So they're pushing cancel culture, hate speech laws. Somebody mentioned it in the session earlier, Germany's democracy enhancement law, which is in the pipeline, which is basically strengthening your friends and making sure that your enemies don't get any money anymore, or imposed even harsher hate speech laws. None of that is going to go down well. It's going to wash with the population. I can also mention that if we're talking about racism, I've never seen so much open racism expressed on our streets as in these last months since October 7th, the attack on Israel by Hamas. People openly chanting anti-Semitic slogans. And the reason is, of course, this doesn't come from the far right, or at least not mainly from the far right. This is the cultural left promoting these kind of ideas. And it is anti-Semitism coming from the Muslim minority. And as Matthew said, they've been encouraged to do that. There's this sacralization, he says, of multiculturalism, encouraging people to feel that they're always right. So none of this, I think, is working. But the most important point, and that's where maybe I'd like to respond, is I don't think we should look only at the elites. I do think we have to look at the populists too. And I don't believe that populists are a homogeneous group. In fact, populists themselves are under democratic pressure. They're also under the scrutiny of the people. And it is a process. I got that point actually from Jacob, because I spoke together with Jacob on a panel at the Battle of Ideas last year in October, and he made that point very, very well. And we can see that. Look at the Rassemblement National by Marine Le Pen. It's not the same party anymore it used to be. So populists themselves are changing. We now have several populist parties in Germany we can choose in the upcoming EU elections. There is not just the AfD anymore. We have a populist party coming from the left, the former head of the Communist Platform, who's founded her own party, Sarah Wagenknecht, making some very important points about cancel culture. We have a populist party called the Free Voters, which is a grassroots party, which is going to be supported or is being supported by a lot of farmers. So they became second strongest party in Bavaria, very important elections last year. And we have another new populist party by a classic conservative, a high civil servant. His name is Hans-Georg Maaßen, who clashed with Angela Merkel over immigration, and has now founded this. He's more like a classic populist of the 1980s, a classic conservative of the 1980s, but because of the developments which Matthew has described, has become very much an outsider. So what we're seeing is an opening up of politics. We're seeing the old constraints being broken up. And I'm not sure if we really, I think you're right about the institutions. The institutions are very much dominated by the kind of new elite. But I do think this pressure, which is coming from below, has put everybody, all political parties in Europe, under a lot of pressure to change. And I think, I'm very kind of hopeful that once this movement continues, and it will continue, and it will not end, that things are going to, Europe is changing very, very fast. The old parties are changing very, very fast. And I think we're just living through interesting times. Nothing we've taken for granted can be taken for granted anymore. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabine. And next, yes, a couple of reflections from Petra. So, when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It was very inspiring. I scribbled down quite a few things, but I decided to talk about something specific, and I also would like to shift the discussion towards Eastern Europe at the end of this conference, because we haven't really talked about that part of Europe. Now, you talk about a new elite, and I would like to talk about the old elite, which is still prevailing in Hungary. I will touch on the issues of the sense of sovereignty, contempt, and the way in which a whole nation has internalized contempt and still, after many years of populist ruling, could not get rid of it. So in Hungary, actually, I would say the same elite has been in power since 1945. Obviously, the generation has changed, but it is the same essence. And despite the fact that we have had a national, sovereignist, populist government for quite a long time, it did not manage to weed out the old establishment. Basically, we are talking about an elite class which has escaped the punishment for crimes of the dictatorship, which has smoothly adopted the rules of the free market economy, and which just overnight turned his face from Moscow to Brussels and stayed in economic, social, and cultural power until this day. It's quite unbelievable. And I would argue that the fact that they are still there has serious consequences. And one of these consequences is that Hungary has not been cured from certain regional pathologies. And of course, as every region, we have quite a few pathologies, but I'm going to specify one certain pathology here, which is the inferiority complex attached to being Eastern or Central Eastern European. Basically, the persistent binary logic within East and West in the collective imagination of Hungarians. Now, I would say that our liberal, now progressive, Europeid elite, which is the continuation of the old elite, is mainly responsible to keep alive this polar image. And obviously, I'm not denying that it is still fueled from the outside. But this old persistent elite is successfully and subserviently nourishing it in Hungary. Now, they obviously have a reason to do so. They suffer from the paradox of an inherent illegitimacy, a sense of illegitimacy. They were born at the wrong side of the continent. Therefore, in their eyes, they believe they are not truly European for the Western side. However, at home they pretend to be, and they act one, and they actually violently decry the inferiority of the masses, and masses not being just the working class. To masses belongs anybody who doesn't live in the capital city, or even being just slightly sovereignist. A sovereignist intellectual would qualify as the masses, which have to be educated, of course. And because of their strong and persistent presence in social and cultural affairs in Hungary, the West continues to be enacted as the only reference point, as a destination that not quite enlightened folk like us will one day reach. And now you might shake your head and think, what is she talking about? I mean, the Hungarian governmental circles, Orban has frequently expressed sovereignist, national, sometimes also anti-EU, anti-NATO, and definitely anti-progressive sentiments for quite a while and quite often, and also that Brussels is a swear word in Hungary many times. And I still claim that the east-west slope has fossilated in the public imagination of Hungarians. So if you ever have a conversation in Hungary, an ordinary or not ordinary public or private conversation, when people talk about their country or their nationality, the word Hungary is always accompanied by temporal adverbs of still and not yet, even in 2024. Be the conversation about political, cultural, social, or even lifestyle issues such as the choice of a perfume. This inferiority complex is attached, is prevalent in the conversation. For example, like I just had this idea about the choice of the perfume. I was reading an interview with a Hungarian parfumeur who studied in France, and he said that the Hungarian public is not ready yet to appreciate his creations. I don't know, maybe I will buy it in 30 years when I will be mature enough, who knows. So you can still not hold a conversation in Hungary without this undertone. So in sum, I might be a wet blanket here because I'm kind of downtoning your hopes for populism. But sincerely, I would have expected a populist, sovereignist government who has been in power for quite a while to weed out this inferiority complex by now. After all, populists, what do they promise? They promise us to liberate the ordinary people from the contempt of the elite, right? That's one of the basic promises. And still, sadly, I feel that they did not manage to challenge the Western paradigm of catching up. They did not manage to legitimize that it is possible and moreover logical that we are engaged differently in the process of globalization. And they didn't manage to challenge completely the unilateral route of returning to Europe. So all in all, I would argue that despite the fact that sovereignist discourse from above is daily heard in Hungary, the majority of the population in Hungary, including those who embrace these nationalist and sovereignist values, are still self-colonized subjects, to borrow Alexander Kiosev's term. And basically, people, I think, have internalized the contempt of the elite to such an extent that after 14 years of populist rule, they still can't escape it. And now I'm listening to myself, and I think I use the same terms. I use still, they still couldn't escape it. So you see, even though I want to fight it, it's inescapable in a way. So yeah, that's about our persistent elite, which is unfortunately not new.
Thanks, Petra. Okay, so we've got, I think, plenty of time for questions and comments. There's lots I could dig into myself, but I'm especially interested to hear from the audience and to try and get a sense of whether both the framing that that our speakers have offered in terms of how to understand populism is kind of correct, or whether you think there's something that's maybe been left out of the conversation. We've covered a lot of ground today. Let's start at the back with my colleague, Maren. I'll buy you all a few seconds to think.
Yes, Maren Tom, MCC Brussels. Sorry to start with a bit of a heavy question, but I think we're seeing a bit of a militarization across Europe, and especially European governments. And an old cliche is, you know, if governments are afraid of their people, they send them to the front. Is there something in this, you know, fear or this kind of equation that there is a kind of relationship between the rise in popularism and the militarization of Europe?
Great, thanks. We've got a couple more questions at the front. Have you got a mic, Benny? Yeah, just hand it there.
Thank you. Arta Moini with MCC Brussels. I'm going to sort of just follow through on Maren's question, which is one thing that I haven't heard much from all of us, from a lot of the panelists today, is maybe the fifth D that we can add to Matt Goodwin's sort of the 4D sort of explanations, which is disillusionment with foreign wars, with the fact that wars have been used as a mechanism for elite empowerment, for myth creation, for so many other things, and with it, you know, the whole issue of Ukraine and Israel. And I also have to add that I completely reject this notion that the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe is only a sort of a one-sided explanation, which is due to like Arab sort of Europeans or immigrants who have this kind of anti-Semitic disposition, and some of them do. But a lot in Europe and in the United States, most of the people who are protesting Israel are white liberals, first of all. And also, we cannot deny the fact that Israel and its actions in Gaza itself is in itself a kind of fuel to this rise of this kind of feeling. And so we have to understand that I think one of the issues here is that we are talking about elites, and yet we are defending, in a way, the kind of elite, neoconservative elite in Israel doing whatever it wants to do, which is not a moral position that I'm trying to point out, is that we have to understand that as a populist movement, we have to be open to new people joining this movement. And a lot of people on the left cannot join something that looks exactly like it was before, like the politics of George W. Bush.
Okay, great, thanks. With the lights, it can be hard to see all your hands, so make sure you do put them up. Richard, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Richard Schenk, also MCC Brussels, and after listening to the debates the entire day, I'm a bit more confused than before, to be honest, because we established the diagnosis on populism. It's going to stay. We looked into the reasons, and I think we have reached consensus on these things. But regarding what's next, I think the question is bigger than before. And the last panel maybe give us some insight in this, because if we cannot get rid of these elites, and the elites are part of this, the elites are waging war against the general population almost, then maybe the solution is that we introduce institutional reform that breaks up the elites into small competing chunks, and then we have some kind of competition among the elites and with the elites and the general population. And how could we achieve this? What institutional reforms could it be? Well, one of them would be obviously European Union. I mean, give it back, more power back to the nation states. Then we have national elites that would compete a bit more among each other. But besides this?
Yeah, great. Okay, let's take one more over there. Then we'll take some responses, and then we'll come back out. But yeah, take the microphone. Please stand and take the mic.
Yep. I think Matt's points about courage and bravery are really important here, and one of the reasons why he attracts quite a lot of criticism and quite a lot of flack is he speaks fairly bluntly. So he finished looking at the sacralization of minorities, because what that means is the stigmatization, the dismissing of the majority of a population in Britain who happen to be white, of course, and he calls a spade, if I may use that expression, by being very, very clear about this, because what is being done by that, what the elite is doing by sacralizing the minority and stigmatizing or dismissing the majority is separating institutions of society and public authority and the state from the nation. It used to be the nation state. They are, through this process, denationalizing it. They are emancipating the state from the people and the nation to which it is supposed to be accountable. And to say that and to spell it out and to explain it is to put yourself in the back bracket of being a patriot, is to put yourself in the bracket of saying what is now unspeakable. I just want to say, and on the note of populism, just literally as a declaration, I mean, if you look back to a country like Britain in the 19th century, when it was ruled by magistrates, it was ruled by guardians, and it was very hard for people to look beyond that reality. But in a very short period of time, within a generation, with movements, populist movements, such as the Chartists, the possibility of new institutions, of new forms of public authority that were constitutionally based in the citizenry of that country through universal suffrage, but also through participation in those days, cooperative movements, and the rest of it. So I don't actually think that there is this huge gulf between populism and a new, better, more accountable democratic future.
Great, thanks. Let's get some responses. Matt, can I start? I knew somehow that this was going to be the session where the Islamism and Israel question would somehow come out. I know you've made a few public interventions in the debate in the UK on this question. How do we tie it together with the populist question as well?
Well, the first thing to say, I think, is what we're witnessing is the rise of a toxic combination of radical woke progressivism on the left, which is anti-Semitic and conspiratorial, and radical violent Islamism. And they are feeding off one another in a way that was not as visible in earlier decades. And we need to be clear about what's going on, because radical progressivism, identity politics, enables radical Islamism by making minority communities sacred and by allowing them essentially to project their identities and their values without criticism. And so what you often find, as we saw in Britain recently, is the debate after October 7th was very quickly reshaped by the elite, not as a debate about how is the left enabling radical Islamists and Hamas sympathizers and supporters, but about the perils of the far right. And the narrative was very quickly reshaped by the elite. That is an unsustainable response strategy, because everybody will see through that. But the dominant threat facing Western democracies in the future will be the alliance between radical leftism and radical Islamism, without question. And just briefly on the EU point, I'm very happy we left the European Union, for the simple reason being that the European Union is not a democratic organization. I mean, if you look at the criteria of democracies, they have to do three things, which is regular elections, they have to give people representation in the legislature, but they also have to have meaningful competition for high executive office. So I never viewed the European Union as a democratic organization. It's always had a democratic deficit at the heart of it. I think then for countries like the UK, then the challenge becomes, how do you then carve out new arenas for public participation and democracy? And I don't think, by the way, citizens' assemblies are the answer to that, for the reason being that citizen assemblies are notoriously rigged by the elite to be stacked with people from the elite. What I think we need are genuine grassroots means of engagement for ordinary citizens in order to try and magnify their voice within the institutions.
Yeah, sure. And Petra, do you want to pick up on some of those?
Yeah, I would just like to align myself more with you on the, I might be alone here in the panel, but on the issue of Israel and anti-Semitism and Palestine. I would challenge your assumption that there is a toxic alliance between Hamas supporters and the woke. I know for sure that many people who are opposing the war at the moment do it on the basis of the issue of sovereignty and anti-establishment sentiments. I mean, seeing that the US and major European powers are aligning with Israel, for them is a sign that they cannot support this.
Yeah.
So, and I know for sure that there are several groups, several people who feel like this. So I don't think this is just a homogeneous group of European Muslims and the Vogue. I think it's way more complex, way more heterogeneous, and they bring in a variety of voices in the discourse. And I think it's very important to keep this debate open also for people who don't necessarily fit into these groups and who maybe form weird alignments.
Okay. Great. Sabine, do you want to pick up on this? You can pick up on some of the other questions.
Well, I actually agree with Matthew 100%. I think there is an alliance between woke and radical Islam. We can see it from the type of people who join these demonstrations. We also see it from the chants of these demonstrations. This is not a normal criticism of Israel. This is actually often a demand to destroy the state of Israel. So from the rivers to the sea is nothing but a call to destroy a sovereign state. I also don't think it's so very new. So we've had this criticism of Israel for a long, long time. It's just not come so much to the fore. And it's now come to the fore precisely because it's being pushed by an immigrant group, and we've always been told that this immigrant group is somehow, as Matthew says, almost holy, almost beyond criticism, because the left has always done this, the German cultural left and the left in other countries, to try to find the ultimate victim, a victim which they can identify with, which they can sort of distract from their own shortcomings, rather than presenting a policy which brings people forward. They like to cling to some kind of victim and then present this as, always right, and this is the kind of thing, that's the kind of thing which brings us forward. And I think that's very, very bad. And what we're seeing, we've seen attacks against people on the street. We know that in Berlin people can't wear or have to be very careful wearing a kippah. People have been advised not to speak Hebrew on the street. Okay. So that's not a normal thing, and I would really say, that's not about, opening ourselves up to other groups.
Okay, great. No. I want to get some more.
I just think this is a really important point. I just want to make one.
No, we'll come back, Matt. We will come back because I know there are loads of people who want to get in. So first was Ulrika from earlier, and then we'll come down to the front.
I just had a sort of added sentence to the question whether you can split the elites. Yeah, and I was just going to ask whether there is any rapprochement between separatist movements and populism. Go throughout the European Union, be this Catalan or Scottish. I also wanted to ask Matthew on the Scottish movement, in favor of Europe. There's a Free Saxonia movement in Germany. There are lots of movements out there. And if the question is how to split elites, I was just to point to the...
Okay. Yeah, great. Can we take Frank, and then I think there's a couple other people who want to get in. We'll try and get in the people I've just seen who have their hands up. We'll get them in if they're all quick, and then we'll have to sum up.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that Israel becomes the point at which everything comes out. And it's actually connected to stuff that existed a long time before October 7th. Because I think what we're seeing here, and it kind of demonstrates the alliance, is a kind of systematic process by which what unites the Islamist movement in Europe and the woke movement in general is their common hatred for Western civilization.
Exactly.
You don't need a PhD in political science to understand that everything about the West is something they loathe. Mm-hmm. And it just so happens that what the problem with Israel is, and with Jews in general, is that they're not just simply Western, not just simply white, but hyper-white. Right? They have more white privilege than anybody else in the world, and that is the reason why you have the situation where the intellectual outlook of the Western elites, the kind of elites that Matthew was talking about, has become so disposed to internalize many of the anti-Semitic tropes. So you take the example of Hollywood. Now, systematically, Hollywood was criticized for being a Jewish industry. I mean, you will know that over the last 50, 60 years, the Jews run Hollywood. That was the general story that was being sold. You look at Hollywood now, and you look at the way that the Hollywood industry, the movie industry, Netflix and all these cultural institutions are behaving, and they systematically communicate a real hatred for not only Israel, but also to downplay the fact that anti-Semitism exists. That's the worst thing. They kind of pretend that, sort of when people say from the river to the sea, that's just a philosophical statement that hasn't got anything to do with exterminating Israel. And it seems to me that what's interesting about this is that the reason why it hasn't got that much to do with Israel is that these sentiments were in place a few years, many years before the war broke out in Gaza. So I think in many ways, it's interesting that this question has come out because it's precisely on this point that you can see the sociological dynamic that's taking place within elite thought and the ease, the almost casual ease with which all of a sudden they can dispossess Jews of the Holocaust and then give the Holocaust back to the Palestinians. I mean, that's a fantastic intellectual jump that has occurred, and it indicates just precisely what I could go on for hours about this.
Yeah.
But I think it's the issue.
Not tonight, you won't. Or maybe you will, whoever's talking to you. But, okay, can we... Yeah, okay, if everyone's quick, we're going to... Benny, can you pass it there? Then we'll go there. And then there was one hand over on this side. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ben Sagat from MCC Brussels. So I have a Hungarian perspective, as I explained at the first panel as well. And I would like to reflect on what Petra Andits said. This story of half success story because the populist or conservative elite managed to become a new elite, but at the same time we have the persistent ancient elite. And in the 90s, the reason for this was during the change of the regime, there was no change of the elite. So this was a bravura that Mr. Orbán managed to go to power and then remain in power. But what happened after 2010, when obviously the left wing, so the former elite, with their own words, they screwed it up. This was the Prime Minister Gyurcsány who said it. And Fidesz won 2/3 majority. The left in Hungary, so the former elite, ran to Brussels and they asked for help. And this is the time when everything happened regarding Hungary bashing, because the left was wise enough in Brussels to say, okay, we will back you. So they spread lies over whole Europe and widespread in the whole world, in the globalized world, and they built a bad image on Hungary. So now the cure against this, I think, is that our allies, or the populists, the conservatives, the nationalists, should do the same and should protect us, should protect Hungary, and also Hungarians should find a way to protect those who are now in minority in the institutions in the UK and otherwhere in Europe. So I think that we need, and it was mentioned, we need courage and bravery, and it is about helping each other. Don't believe in demonization. And this is a huge problem, because when I remember the time when we were in the EPP and we had talks, and they said, okay, we agree with you, but the press would write a bad article on us if we back you in public, publicly. And now if you go on the right of the EPP, from the EPP, I kind of sometimes hear some similar conversations, okay. And it's not good. I think we need bravery, and united, we stand stronger.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, so there's the microphone here, then while the microphone's moving back. So yeah, you...
Thank you. I think the point I would like to make is that the populist movement also, I think, has dropped the ball on one other point, and I think that is that the wokeism has kind of hijacked the moral dimension and made it seem as if the moral dimension is on their side, and you could say the pragmatic dimension is on the other side. So, for example, on the economy, and it's morally bad in the woke movement, for example, to be anti-migration. But I think this is also something that people, especially the young generation who lives with quite a lot of despair, would need also in the responsibility of these new movements, is to also stand up, with talking about courage, to find a way to also put out what Western values are and what right and wrong is. And I think this happens not enough. A lot of people are, when they're put in the front in the political domain, are afraid, and I understand because of the demonization, but I think this is something we should also implement together.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, we're just going to take the last couple of hands I saw. So there's this gentleman here. Yeah. And then there's one lady at the back, and then we'll have to close. Sorry.
I'd like to thank, I will make sure, Herman Kelly is my name, President of the Irish Freedom Party. I will make sure that as many people as possible see Matt's talk there. I think it was the best summary of the elitist woke project that I've heard, well, ever. There we go. A very clear example of what you talk about, the radicalization of the elite, is actually Leo Varadkar, the former Irish Prime Minister who stepped down yesterday. 20 years ago, I actually interviewed him as a journalist. 20 years ago, he was pro-life, opposed to gay marriage, opposed to immigration, and rejected all this gender ideology. Step forward 20 years, pro-abortion, pro-gay marriage, pro-gender wacko ideology, and massive immigration of unvetted males. It really does show the leftist radicalization, and that's, I think, we're missing a little trick, because we have to also talk about the influence of, well, you actually did mention it, actually, about the media, the NGO class. One name that we kind of missed today was Gramsci. We have to do a reverse roll through the institutions. We have a long-term project, and I'll finish up with one point. I think we can insert ourselves and find a point of weakness when they talk about solidarity, everyone's equal. Well, they're talking about the new elite, the sacralization of minorities. We can smash up their narrative a little bit, I believe, by emphasizing the equality of all people before the law, because at the moment, anti-free speech legislation is the government giving privileges to certain minorities. We must emphasize the equality of all citizens before the law and reject this privileged minorities. Thank you.
Great. So there's a lady here, then I'm going to ask the panel in reverse order to give us just a few thoughts to end on, but that lady there, yeah.
Yes, I'm very pleased that the previous question raised the question of Gramsci, and I think maybe everything we're talking about today is about the cultural hegemony, so the left could achieve it. Maybe it's now our turn to get it, and I'm very pleased that these kind of think tanks can help to achieve this regaining of the cultural hegemony.
Okay, yeah, great, thanks. Okay, so let's take some summary. We don't have very long, so maybe like a minute and a half, just some final thoughts. I know the conversation's ranged over a lot of territory, but Petra, some final thoughts.
Can I just reflect on the Israel issue? Because it's also something very personal for me. I have been doing did research in Israel for 4 years, so I feel this is also a personal matter for me. I didn't say that this is not happening, this alliance. I said that the picture is way more complicated. I mean, if you look at the fact that Gaza is being bombed by rockets decorated with LGBT flags, then, you know, it kind of interrupts this dichotomy between woke Muslim alliance and us, basically. Second, Muslims, European Muslims have, it's also a complicated position they have, because there were times, and there are times when they have acted as allies of the populist right. For example, in several demonstrations across Europe or the United States on gender issues and on issues on educating the children, on gender, on the new gender madness. And also, we have to remember that woke is not always an ally of the Muslim minority. For example, Muslims have been demonized by the woke itself, the woke segment of society. of being anti-feminist, of being anti-gay, etc. So I think this is a very complicated picture, and we have to keep it more sophisticated than this very simple dichotomy. That's all.
Yeah, no, great, thanks. I'll come back to this point about it being complicated in a second, but Sabine.
Well, I actually agree with the point which was made over there that we have to be very clear about our values and Western values, and that's often fallen much too short. And I think it does link into this issue of Israel again, and in that sense it is interesting that Israel is being raped, because we had the biggest massacre against Jews since the Holocaust. Women have been raped. And we have people, and we have a clear Islamist group, which is Hamas, which is not even fighting for the independence of Palestinians. And yet we have people going onto the streets and cheering at them and saying this is a great thing. So there's obviously something very, very wrong with our values. We just have to, re-establish the kind of values we want to stand for in Europe and say, raping of women is wrong. Anti-Semitism has brought us into the worst situation we could ever imagine. So if we see this coming up again, we can see that there's something very, very seriously wrong. We say, no, we defend, Israel is indeed being criticized because it's a Western state. And I think, that's, we have to defend, we really have to defend Western states and say, we stand for something very different.
Great, thanks. Matthew, some final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll say what I was going to say before, which is...
So you got a chance. So.
Yeah, we have to be very clear about the main threat that's facing Western civilization, and that threat in the next few years is coming from an alliance between radical Islamism and a radicalized cultural left, and they share many key things in common. We just need to be clear about what those things are. They are both revolutionary belief systems. They are not just radical. They want to completely overthrow Western ways of life and values. They both subordinate individual rights behind group identities. They have no serious interest in preserving individual rights. They would both happily sacrifice free speech and free expression on the altar of their religious or political claims. They are both organized around rituals. They are iconoclastic. They are anti-Semitic, they are anti-democratic, and they are enabling one another through their distinctive belief systems. Now, we can sit around and say, well, that's a simplistic view of the world, or reality is more complex. And of course, it always is, but we also have to remind ourselves of what the principal threat to our way of life is going to be over the next few decades, and just simply look at the demographic projections of where Sweden is going to be in 2050, where Germany is going to be in 2050, where France is going to be in 2050, where the UK is. You can get it all from the Pew Research Center. They've mapped this all, where European democracies are going to be if we maintain current migration rates. And I can tell you this alliance that I'm talking about is going to be at the very heart of how European societies are transformed. So we can either get wise about it, understand it, think about how we might challenge it, which means rooting out these ideologies in schools and universities. It means exposing young people to a much wider range of views and beliefs. It means removing people from Western societies who are committing crimes, glorifying Islamist terrorism. It means severing links with organizations that tacitly support radical Islamism, which I'm happy to see the UK government is finally starting to do. And it means requiring Muslim communities themselves to be much more proactive and vocal at calling out extremists within their midst, among many other things. I've written all about this on Substack. The key point is that is the dominant threat going forward in European societies, and that is what we should remain focused on.
Great. Can we thank the panel? Right, so just very briefly, I wanted to echo that I agree with lots of my colleagues on the panel. I might take a position maybe slightly closer to Sabine's and Petra, but one thing I really think is important is that it is very, very complicated, the period that we're moving into. I don't think the alliances that that are coming up are kind of just obvious and that we're going to better understand things. Just only the other day I was speaking to a group of, I guess you call them Gen Zers, who were anti-immigration, anti-woke, anti all these things, but they were so instinctively on the side of Palestine and possibly even Hamas over Israel that it was clear that some of the things we'd like to read about politics are maybe not as straightforward as we make them, and what we all need, much better arguments to kind of confront this moment, but also we need a bit of a space in which we can have these conversations. That's what we're trying to do at MCC Brussels here. So I do invite you all, if this is your first or maybe you've come back, but join us in the various ways in which you can. You can come to our events like this one. You can come to our next event, which is on the 9th of April, which will be taking a look at whether the United States of Europe is a fantasy or a reality. But you can also kind of stay in touch in the interim. You can join us following us on Twitter. You can read our fortnightly Substack. Everybody's got a Substack now, including us, which is called Freedom Freaks. If you're working in European politics in some way and you'd like to hear about how we might maybe work together or support each other, get in touch. We'd love to meet you for a coffee or a beer. But I guess most of all, keep coming to our events. We'd like to hear more from you. But the final thing you can all do to kind of help us move this conversation forward is join us for a glass of wine and we'll carry on the discussion. So thank you very much.